In the heart of New York City, where the cacophony of honking taxis and bustling crowds never ceased, Elara lived a life that felt as scripted as the puppet shows she performed. Her days were spent in a dimly lit theater where the scent of dust and old wood clung to the air like a persistent ghost. Her fingers, calloused from years of manipulating marionettes, longed for something more than the routine dance of strings and shadows. She dreamed of authenticity, of emotions untainted by the artificiality of the stage. Elara's life had been a series of disappointments, each one carving a deeper groove into her heart. Her father, a once renowned puppeteer, had vanished mysteriously when she was just a child, leaving behind only his legacy and a theater on the brink of ruin. Her mother, unable to cope with the loss, had retreated into a world of silence, her eyes perpetually fixed on the stage as if waiting for her husband to return. Elara had inherited the theater, along with the burden of keeping it alive, even as her own dreams withered under the weight of responsibility. One particularly disheartening evening, after a performance that left her feeling hollow, Elara wandered through the labyrinthine streets of the city. The neon lights flickered ominously, casting distorted shadows that danced along the pavement. It was then that she stumbled upon an alleyway she had never noticed before, a narrow passage that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. At the end of the alley stood a shop, its windows clouded with dust, the sign above it barely legible: Curiosities and Wonders. Inside the shop was a dimly lit labyrinth of curiosities, each item more peculiar than the last. The air was thick with the scent of aged leather and incense, creating an atmosphere that felt both inviting and foreboding. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with oddities that seemed to whisper secrets from the past. Antique clocks with frozen hands, dusty tomes with faded titles, and peculiar trinkets that glinted mysteriously in the low light. Elara's eyes wandered over these strange objects, her curiosity piqued by their silent stories, but it was the marionette hanging from the ceiling that truly captured her attention. Its wooden limbs were intricately carved, each joint meticulously crafted to mimic the fluidity of human movement. The marionette's eyes were eerily lifelike, painted with such detail that they seemed to follow her every move, glinting with a strange, almost knowing light. It hung there, suspended by thin, delicate strings that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, casting long, spidery shadows on the walls. As Elara stood transfixed, the shopkeeper emerged from the shadows, his presence as enigmatic as the shop itself. He was a tall, slender man, dressed in a suit that seemed to belong to another era, its fabric worn yet elegant. His face was gaunt, with sharp, angular features that gave him an air of mystery. But it was his eyes that held Elara captive. Deep and knowing, they seemed to pierce through her very soul, as if seeing the desires she kept hidden even from herself. His voice, smooth and melodic, broke the silence. "Ah, I see you found our most special piece," he said, gesturing towards the marionette. "This puppet," he whispered, leaning in as if sharing a secret, "can grant your deepest desire." Elara hesitated, her rational mind warning her to walk away. The shopkeeper's words seemed too fantastical, too impossible to believe. Yet, there was something in his gaze, a flicker of truth that tugged at her heart. She felt a strange pull towards the marionette, a yearning for something more than the life she knew. "How can a puppet grant desires?" she asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. The shopkeeper smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Ah, my dear," he replied, "it's not the puppet itself, but the magic it holds. You see, it responds to the soul of its master, fulfilling the wishes that lie deep within." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But beware," he added, his tone turning grave, "for such power comes with a price." Elara's heart raced, a tumultuous storm of hope and fear swirling within her. The promise of something more, something real, was too enticing to resist. She imagined a life where her performances were not just acts, but true expressions of her soul, where her dreams were not confined to the stage. The marionette seemed to call out to her, its strings coiled neatly in her hands, waiting to be brought to life. With a deep breath, she made her decision, handing over the money with trembling fingers. The shopkeeper wrapped the marionette carefully, his eyes never leaving hers. "Remember," he said softly, "your desires are powerful. Use them wisely." Elara nodded, clutching the marionette to her chest as she left the shop, her mind a whirlwind of possibilities. As she stepped back into the bustling streets of New York, the weight of the marionette in her arms felt both comforting and ominous, a reminder of the unknown journey she was about to embark upon. As the days passed, Elara spent countless hours in the dim light of her small apartment, practicing with the puppet. The marionette seemed to come alive under her touch, its wooden limbs moving with a grace that was almost human. Her own movements became more fluid, as if the puppet was an extension of her own being. It responded to her desires in ways that defied explanation, mirroring her emotions with uncanny precision. When she felt joy, the puppet danced with a lightness that captivated audiences. When she felt sorrow, it conveyed a depth of emotion that brought tears to the eyes of those watching. Her performances became more than mere shows. They were raw, visceral expressions of her innermost feelings. The theater, once struggling to fill seats, now buzzed with excitement. Word spread quickly about the puppeteer whose shows left audiences spellbound, and soon every performance was met with rapturous applause. Elara reveled in the success, feeling for the first time that her dreams were within reach. Yet beneath the surface of this newfound success, a sinister undercurrent flowed, one that she could not ignore. It began with small incidents, easily dismissed as accidents. Her closest friend, a fellow puppeteer named Marcus, fell from the stage during a rehearsal. The sound of his leg shattering echoed through the theater, a sickening crack that left Elara frozen in horror. Marcus lay on the floor, his face contorted in agony, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone protruding grotesquely through the skin. The sight was burned into Elara's mind, a grim reminder of the fragility of life. Then there was the theater's janitor, Mr. Hargrove, a kind old man who had known her father and treated Elara like a granddaughter. She found him one morning, crumpled at the bottom of a staircase, his body twisted in a way that seemed impossible. His limbs were bent at odd angles, his face a mask of pain, yet his eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling as if caught in a final moment of terror. The image haunted Elara, filling her with a creeping sense of dread that gnawed at her insides. Each incident was more gruesome than the last, leaving Elara plagued by guilt and suspicion. She couldn't shake the feeling that these accidents were somehow connected to the puppet, that its influence extended beyond the stage. The marionette, once a source of joy, now filled her with dread. It was as if it had a life of its own, its eyes following her every move, its strings tugging at her soul. She began to notice changes within herself, subtle at first, but growing more pronounced with each passing day. Her reflection in the mirror seemed foreign, her eyes darker, shadowed with something she couldn't quite name. Her smile, once warm and genuine, now twisted with an edge of malice that sent chills down her spine. It was as if the puppet's dark energy was seeping into her very being, altering her in ways she couldn't control. Elara's mind became a battleground, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and confusion. She questioned her sanity, wondering if the puppet was truly to blame, or if she was losing her grip on reality. The once comforting weight of the marionette now felt like a burden, its strings a constant reminder of the darkness lurking beneath her success. In the quiet moments, when the theater was empty and the applause had faded, Elara would sit alone on the stage, the puppet resting lifelessly in her lap. She would stare into its eyes, searching for answers, but finding only her own reflection staring back, twisted and unfamiliar. The marionette's presence was inescapable, its influence a shadow that loomed over her every waking moment. Elara knew she had to find a way to break free from the puppet's hold, to reclaim her life before it consumed her completely. But as the days turned into weeks, and the accidents continued to mount, she felt the strings tightening around her, pulling her deeper into the darkness. The line between puppeteer and puppet blurred, leaving Elara trapped in a nightmare of her own making, her soul tethered to a fate she could not escape. Elara's dreams were haunted by visions of a shadowy figure, its face obscured, its hands manipulating her like a marionette. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, the puppet always at her bedside, its wooden fingers curled into a mocking gesture. Desperate for answers, Elara returned to the shop, only to find it abandoned, the windows boarded up, the sign above it faded into obscurity. The shopkeeper was nowhere to be found, his promise of granting desires now a cruel joke. Elara was left alone, trapped in a nightmare of her own making. As the puppet's influence grew, Elara found herself losing control over her actions. Her performances became more erratic, her movements jerky and unnatural. The audience watched in awe, unaware of the torment unfolding behind the curtain. Elara was no longer the puppeteer. She was the puppet, her strings manipulated by an unseen force. In a moment of clarity, Elara realized the truth. The puppet was a conduit for a dark force, one that fed on human emotions, consuming her humanity with each performance. She was becoming a mere marionette, her desires twisted into a grotesque parody of themselves. Determined to break free from the puppet's sinister grasp, Elara planned one final performance, a haunting dance that she hoped would sever the strings binding her to the malevolent marionette. She spent sleepless nights crafting the choreography, each movement meticulously designed to convey her struggle, her desperation, and her ultimate defiance. As the night of the performance arrived, the theater was shrouded in an eerie silence, the air thick with anticipation. The audience, unaware of the tragedy about to unfold, sat in hushed expectation, their eyes fixed on the stage. The lights dimmed, casting long shadows that crept across the theater walls like specters. Elara stepped into the spotlight, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. Her costume, a tattered gown that mirrored her own unraveling, fluttered around her like ghostly tendrils. The puppet hung from her fingers, its eyes glinting with malevolent intent, its presence a palpable weight that threatened to drag her down into the abyss. As the music began, a haunting melody that echoed her inner turmoil, Elara moved with a grace that belied the chaos within. Each step was a battle against the force that sought to control her, her movements fluid yet tinged with desperation. The puppet seemed to come alive in her hands, its limbs jerking and twisting in a macabre dance that mirrored her own struggle. The audience watched, entranced, unaware of the dark energy that pulsed through the theater like a living thing. As the dance reached its climax, Elara felt the strings tighten, pulling her towards an inevitable end. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her muscles burning with exertion, yet she pushed onward, driven by a fierce determination to reclaim her life. The puppet's eyes bore into hers, mocking her with their unholy gleam, as if daring her to defy its will. With a final, defiant gesture, Elara summoned every ounce of strength she possessed and cut the strings. The sound of snapping threads echoed through the theater, a sharp crack that seemed to split the very air. The puppet fell lifeless to the floor, its wooden body collapsing in a heap, its eyes now empty and devoid of the malevolent spark that had haunted her for so long. The audience erupted into applause, their cheers a deafening roar that filled the theater. They were oblivious to the sacrifice that had been made, the true cost of the performance they had just witnessed. Elara stood center stage, her heart pounding, her soul teetering on the edge of oblivion. In that moment, she understood the true cost of her desire for authenticity. The puppet had granted her wish, but at the expense of her humanity. As the lights dimmed, Elara felt her body grow heavy, her limbs stiffening as if turning to stone. Her mind slipped into darkness, a cold, suffocating void that threatened to swallow her whole. The curtain fell, leaving the audience in stunned silence, their applause fading into echoes that reverberated through the empty theater. Elara's final performance was one of haunting beauty, a tragic tale of a puppeteer who became a puppet, her strings cut, her life extinguished. In the dim light of the theater, the puppet lay on the stage, its eyes empty, its wooden body a testament to the price of desire. Elara's story would be told for generations, a cautionary tale of the dangers of longing for something more, of the thin line between human and puppet, life and death, light and shadow. As the theater emptied, the ghostly echoes of Elara's dance lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of the darkness that had claimed her. The puppet, now lifeless and forgotten, remained on the stage, a silent witness to the tragedy that had unfolded, its presence a chilling reminder of the price one pays for chasing their deepest desires.